We're up to 2 Samuel now, and I was noticing, by the way, if you go to the website and if you go to scroll down, if you're not getting daily growth, I strongly urge you to consider getting it. It's a free thing that you get on a daily basis. So on the home page, you scroll down a little bit, you see the daily growth, and then this will give you today's daily growth, which happens to be pretty close to where we are. This is 2 Samuel 12. It's on an annual cycle. And we just continue to do that. So these are, again, the 365 key chapters of the Bible based upon Handbook to Scripture. And it always provides then an overview of that in a couple paragraphs. And then there's also a daily prayer. And at this point, it's from Handbook to Prayer. And then the third component is a daily encouragement. And so, again, this is from Handbook to God's Promises. So it's a kind of a easy way of getting an overview of things, praying scripture back to God, resources you can use. So I really encourage you to consider getting the Daily Growth email. So that's just something for you. And then let's pick up where we left off here. So this is from a previous year, but 2 Samuel 5 is where we're up to. We're going to be zooming in on a few of the chapters again from this book. And if we take a look at what's involved in 2 Samuel 5, just to give you a little bit of a sense of it. I have a visual presentation for all the books of the Bible. And so there's about over 70 of them, because it includes the Bible as a whole, the New Testament, the poets and prophets and so forth. So we've just, Bill Ibsen and I, a number of years ago, created visuals for every one of these. So I sometimes use these as kind of a resource for it. So this was the introduction and the title. And it's a helpful way of just beginning, because what we're looking at in 2 Samuel is it's recording, effectively, the highlights of David's reign. And it's first over the territory of Judah, and then finally over the entire nation of Israel. And what we see here is it traces his ascension to the throne. And then it tells us also, unfortunately, in chapter 11, which is a pivotal point in the book, about his sin with Bathsheba, and then the climatic consequences of that sin. It's intriguing, the idea that he is forgiven, but there is an ongoing consequence that endures as a result of that. And it's a difficult process for us to go through, the realization that God is a God of grace, and one of the things I love about the heroes of Scripture is that they have feet of clay like us. And so we also see God as being one who gives us another opportunity. He's a God of the second chance of grace. But it doesn't mean, though, that there aren't consequences to our acts. But even here, I've often thought about that process in terms of remorse and regret. How many times do you wrestle with that? With the question of remorse and regret. I think of regret for lost goods. And there are some wonderful things that you have for a short season, and they're gone. For example, you'll only have toddlers for a short while. It's an interesting thing, and there's something beautiful about those marvels and creatures. And then the regret for lost things, that there are so many. But then there's also remorse for the blunders that we've made over the years, and also for the errors that others have committed against us as well, so that we also look back and realize that those things, if we're not careful, can define us. And when I'm thinking about David, it makes me think about this idea of having a person who is a man after God's own heart, and yet he still succumbs. And we see this as a cautionary tale, a reminder that let's take heed lest we fall, because don't be supposing that you are immune to this area. We all can struggle and wrestle with this. By the way I handle those two things now is I do spiritual judo with them. What I do is, when I see the thing coming, that the pain of remorse and regret, I take that as a reminder of truth. So I turn the error, the lie, into a truth. Because you see, the lie is that we're defined by that. And I'm claiming we're not defined in Christ by those mistakes that we've made, the ill-intentioned actions of others against us. But we're not defined by that. Instead, I believe we're defined by what God's going to even do with that. And so we are in a soul-forming process, in a soul-forming world. And he's, I think, going to use even those things for a greater good. So their joy of the unbounded future, because he works all things together, including even those kinds of things, in ways we could not yet begin to imagine. We can't see, but we will see. So the way I put it, and you've heard me say this before, we're not defined by the pain of the bounded past. By bounded, I mean, how long is your life? How long a sequence? And it's only a few decades. And it zips by so quickly. But you're not defined by the pain of that short little bit of time. In fact, use the 1,000-year perspective. And it's when I read these texts of Scripture, we're looking at thousands of years since the time. And using that 1,000-year perspective, we ask, what difference would this make 1,000 years from now? And how can God use this as well? And so my belief is that we are defined now by the joy of our unbounded future, that God's what he's going to do with that. So even here, he's going to work it together in a way that will actually lead to a greater good that we cannot yet imagine or construe. And when I do that then, and anytime I'm tempted to be under that burden or under that weight, I can give it back to God and use it as a reminder that in spite of the blunders, he still has a hope and a purpose for us and having an aspiration for home. Now going to the date of this book, just a few little things I'm taking from that material. What we're dealing with here is it was written after the death of Solomon. We know that from material in there, but before the Assyrian captivity. And it's likely that Samuel was composed early in the divided kingdom, somewhere around this period of time. And so the setting of this story, it's David's great story of that really begins in 1 Samuel 16, and then continues all the way to 2 Kings chapter 2. And 2 Samuel rather, is what it's doing here, is focusing on the major events of David's 40-year rule. And it starts with his reign in Hebron, which began in 1011 BC. And that went to 1004 BC. So a 7.5-year reign there. And then he became king over all of the tribes of Israel. And that 33-year reign then over the united Judah and Israel lasts from 1004 to 971 BC. So it just gives you a bit of an idea of what we're doing with this material here. And so want to just pull some things out here that might be of value to you here. But what you have, I'll just say very briefly, you really start with David's triumphs, and we'll go into this more later on. But then his transgressions. So it begins well. And then in chapter 10, that's an awful combination where he violates virtually half the law, because he commits not only the sins of adultery and murder, but also of lust, of coveting, and any number of things. So he violates the law in such a way that he says, I can't actually, there's no sacrifice that covers this. And so I have to appeal to your mercy, to your grace. And the astonishing thing to me is that when I think about Psalm 51, it's David's public record of the sin that he committed. And it's an amazing thought that he knew this would be now actually a part of Israel's worship in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. So the fact that he uses this as a divine lesson for the lives of others as well. Even our mistakes can be redemptive in that respect. And so you see the transgressions and then the consequences of that. So you have success and then sin and failure, or obedience, disobedience, and then the judgment that follows. So just to give you a sense or an idea of what that's like then. So with the theme and the purpose of this book, as I see it then, there are certain basic motifs and themes. And when I think about that, one of them is this no break between 1 Samuel 31 and 2 Samuel 1. It was one book in the Hebrew Bible. I don't know why they separated it, but it was the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, the book of Chronicles. So they didn't have a first and second of those books. They were later put together in that way. So they had 22 books in the Hebrew Bible, but they're the same as the 39 books in our Bible. It's just that they're listed differently. So it's this continuity here. There's no real break in that narrative. In the two books of Samuel, as I say then, it gives us a divine perspective on Saul and David's rule in the context of tribal hostility between the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes, what would be called Israel and then Judah. And for a period of time, there was a united kingdom, but then they would be divided into those two. As a consequence, then, the split would take place in the year 931 BC. And as a result of that, after the death of Solomon, then there was a complete loss. It was a very candid portrait. Part of the power of Scripture is that it gives us a candid portrayal and doesn't paint him in an unrealistic light. It shows his greatness, but also his vulnerability. And so we see those strengths. And they're clearly reinforced and illustrated in the life of David. Many spiritual truths. The most obvious is the cause and effect principle that's stressed in every book since Genesis. Obedience, and this is the fundamental principle. He's not glorified. You get a balanced presentation in this understanding. And we come to understand that obedience brings blessing. Disobedience brings judgment. It's not that complicated, but at the same time, when we see sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. And it's a frightening word to me, that image, because when I think about this idea of a kind of a scale, when I think of this idea of looking at it from the standpoint of a person's life, we've seen this before, but just by way of reminder, because this is kind of a chilling thing for me. When you look at a neutral life here, and you just pick up something like this, and so you start off here, let me just get it here, and you say, now, when you see a person, say a religious leader who has been caught, and maybe got away with it for years. I'm thinking and of course you well know the media really love to exploit these themes. But how has it happened? So a guy wakes up and he's committed adultery and he's been in an illicit relationship for possibly years. He's covered it up with success. And then he gets caught finally. I suspect his worst day was not the day he got caught, but the morning he woke up on the second day when he realized that nightmare is not a nightmare, it's reality. See, the reality, how did he get there? How could you get to the point where you would commit that act? And the answer is, you never become a -8 without becoming a -7. You see, that's the point. You can't get there. If you can't go from a -2 to a -8, there's too much cognitive dissonance. You couldn't justify it. It'd be too painfully obvious. But instead, the Satan tempts in small ways, in subtle degrees. And so there is a process where you can kind of cultivate and curate and rationalize. And every compromise you make, so you become you became a -7. How did you become a -7? Because you became a -6. And how did you become a -6? And so it goes. By the way, by the same token, just as there's a vicious cycle, there's a virtuous cycle. Because nobody wakes up and they're suddenly spiritual. They're not suddenly be a +6. You got there only because you were a +5. You see, the same principle. A very gradual process, a long obedience in the same direction. And so, you can rationalize your sin. And so we deceive ourselves by the smallness of our surrenders. And the concept then is, was it not a small thing? So you do a little bit, and then the next one becomes possible. And this is how I put it here. Sometimes then, a thing, if it's an area where you become a -2 or 3, it's got a beach hold in your life. And you can still deal with it. It hasn't been brought into action yet. It's been theoretical at this point. It's an influence, though. But then it can become a stronghold by the time you get more like in this area, around a 5 or a 6. And then it can become a stranglehold, you see. It's like demonic influence as well. Influence, harassment, control. So there are different degrees in which we can actually do this. And that's the frightening thought when I consider a text like that we're approaching here. It can be very difficult indeed. Going back to our text, though, just to give you an illustration of this, what we're looking at here is in our a struggle for power in around 1010 BC in 2 Samuel 2-4. So the chapters immediately before the one we're going to be looking at talks about how after Saul died, there was a struggle for power, and it ensued between David and Ishbosheth, which was Saul's youngest and only surviving son. And David ruled over his native tribe of Judah from Hebron. So here you see, before he conquered Jerusalem, and we're going to see that in this chapter, he was reigning from that. And then Ishbosheth was reigning from this area up in the north. And then this was a temporary period of time for 7 years. And then his power grew, and eventually Ishbosheth and his commander Abner were assassinated, and that led David to be the unrivaled king of both sides. So in our own text of Scripture, then we go back to this, and we take a look and see where we see that now that that's taken place, all the tribes of Israel come to David, and they go to Hebron and say, "Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. And the Lord said to you, you will be shepherd my people Israel. You're going to be a ruler over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron, and they anointed King David king over Israel. So now what we can see here is that all of this has taken place. Now David now becomes, in fact, the unrivaled king. And so it tells us then he reigned over Judah for 7.5 years, it tells us. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years. So he would conquer Jerusalem. So the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, because we know that the Jebusites had that territory. And just to give you an image of that, this is Jerusalem in the time of David. So after he conquered Jerusalem, he would have these walls and built the Millo, which was a terraced construction on a steep slope in which houses were built. And they'll tell us about how he built this, how he built a lot of these areas here. And it was a kind of a stepstone structure that he built. So it was a smaller city then. And then later on, in the time of Solomon, it would grow. And Solomon then would expand Jerusalem, you can see, and build this whole enormous temple complex on the top of Mount Moriah. And so this would be an amazing expansion. And it was the height, really, of Israel's rule and authority and power. It was the height of its glory at that time. So just to give you a feel for what we're looking at then. So it tells us they went against the Jebusites because they were not able to conquer them during the time of Joshua. And the inhabitants were still there. And he says, "You're not going to come, the blind and the lame will turn you away." And so David actually, though, nevertheless captured the stronghold of Zion. And then it would be called the city of David. And then he speaks about this idea. There was a water tunnel as well. And we knew about this water tunnel with Hezekiah's water tunnel underneath as well. But he built it all around from the Millo and inward. And he became greater and greater, for the Lord God of hosts was with him. So we can see again, here's a man after God's own heart. He was selected because he was a man who actually knew him not by way of hearsay, but by experience. He was a musician, and he composed psalms when he was a shepherd, and he was under the starry sky. And it's always interesting because we rarely see the sky as they would have seen it then. When you just think about what the sky was like. Let me just see if I can find like this. I mean, that's pretty impressive. You're rarely going to see that. But it was what it would be like. Now, slightly amplified because of a bit of light exposure and so forth. But you get the idea that they are seeing this. And by the way, the most astonishing thing, and this is the rim of your Milky Way galaxy, and that it was only in the 20th century, in the 1920s, that it was realized that we're only one galaxy out of billions of galaxies. Carl Sagan, billions and billions. And so the idea of these galaxies, I'm trying to find an image of these galaxies. So you look at these starry skies and you behold the glory of God there. And we see things that they would have never been able to see before. I'm going back to this. This is the Hubble Deep Field. Nobody could have ever imagined such a thing. We're looking here at this deep field image of a portion of the sky where there was nothing known. And after collecting the light over several days, it's about an area of a dime at the arm's length. And then it opened up thousands of galaxies, each an island universe with hundreds of billions of galaxies. You see, we are privileged to see things that others never saw before. When I think about nature, and I think about this, I may have shown you this already, but this is, although we are not as close to nature as they were then, they had a greater familiarity experientially. We have a vastly greater knowledge of nature on every level. Imagine, you see this. What are you looking at here? You're looking at your planet. This is the planet Earth seen through the rings of Saturn. It's a marvel, and no one in previous ages could have seen it. And certainly, it's also true when you behold this. I think I showed this before, but I'm so fond of it. This radiolarian, and radiolarian is a microscopic protozoan. This is basically a single-celled creature, microscopic. That is more elegant than a rose window in a cathedral. How can this be? And so we are actually privileged to have access to things that was unimaginable then. And I think it's so profoundly important for us to become observers of His created world, because I find it to be a force multiplier in enhancing my vision of the glory of God and training myself to see this glory. Well, David did that beautifully when he was under the starry skies. And so we see, but he was not privileged to see. He could never have imagined this. So again, you and I, only in the last few decades are we seeing wonders and marvels on every order of magnitude, from the microscopic to the macroscopic, things we could have never imagined or beheld. And so it's a great joy and a privilege to see this and to marvel. If anything, then we need to train and tune our minds and become aware of all the glories of God, because if we do not do that, we're going to be so filled with the tensions of this passing world that we're going to be, again, wringing our hands in despair, rather than understanding that our God reigns and His glory is so wonderful, so much more rich and abundant than any AI will ever be able to develop. That it's a reminder then of a man who knew God, and he knew Him well. And so David knew Him because he studied the purposes of God in his own experience as a shepherd in the wilderness. So when I think about David, then I think about the concept of how there is a man then who knew God. He was a man after God's own heart. He was a man who was a musician, who was a poet, and he was a mighty man of warfare as well. And we know the story that took place in 1 Samuel 17 with David and Goliath. And that extraordinary story that takes place where this simple shepherd takes these 5 smooth stones and puts them in his pouch. And with his accuracy that he would have to ward off predators, he hits them right in the skull. So again, not by our weapons of the flesh, because had he tried to use the weaponry that Saul gave him, he would have never made it. Instead, our warfare is not against flesh and blood, but our weapons are against the principalities and powers, and so we use God's forces in that way. So again, I try to find analogies in all of these themes. And so we see a man then who knew God, who loved Him, and who pursued Him. And in spite of his horrible blunder in chapter 11, he still is given the grace of forgiveness and restoration, but still there would be consequences. Hiram's king of Tyre sent messengers to David with cedar trees and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a house for David. And he realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Sadly, however, the next verse. Meanwhile, David took more concubines and wives. What's going on? So how can you have a man where the law makes it very clear that this is not God's desire? And of course, this would become a troubling thing, as it would become to his son Solomon as well, that this would become a thorn in his side. And all these internecine conflicts would occur as a result of all these other alliances, sexual alliances and dalliances that were simply not necessary. So he was a man of passion for God, but also he had other passions that were not reined in. So it's a difficult thing. How can the same person again do this? And sometimes it's almost like a schizoid kind of a thing. We're all imposters to some degree, if you stop and think about it. We all are imposters, and yet at the same time our desire is to be men who have accountability, men who will not succumb to this downward pull, but who have people who can ask us questions. What are you doing in this? Why are you doing that? And it appears to me whenever I hear of a spiritual leader who succumbs, and how many have we heard of in the last just 3-4 years alone? And it's a horrendous experience to see. People we thought we knew. And we discovered there was a whole dark side of that person that nobody knew. And there's the point. Nobody knew it. And so it was hidden. And if you have that area in yourself that you're struggling with and nobody knows about it, if you don't name that demon, it has a power over you. When you name it to another man and give him permission to ask you how you're doing in that area, you diminish its power because you know now another knows what you're struggling with. We all have sin proclivities. We all have a flesh pattern, and we can actually succumb. So it's good for you to be brutally honest with your flesh pattern, is it not? It's to be aware of that and to understand where the danger could lie, because otherwise we're going to be seeing here that the flesh can just overwhelm us. And as you know, with me, I've told you this, I wrote this in conform to his image. This is my flesh pattern, signature. We all have a flesh signature. Some of you, so these 4 areas, it's not, it may not be another, and in the area of gambling has never been a big deal with me. In fact, I remember going to 3 casinos, and in each case, it was a sociological study. I didn't spend a penny, but instead I asked people, are you enjoying yourself? As they're working two machines at the same time. And there's one, we're pulling down this thing. I remember Harris and Nolans, and then another one in Lake Charles, and another one in Atlantic City. All 3, I did the same thing. And I'm astonished because remember, there's no clocks. There's no lights, no windows, no nothing. Horrible noise, horrible colors, horrible everything. It's like hell to me. So I'm going in there. So I go up, it's a sociological experiment. I say, so here they pull this thing down, and no sooner they pull this chain, but they pull the next one down. And they're going back and forth. And are you enjoying yourself? I've had factory work that was more enjoyable than that, you see? Because they seem to gain no pleasure. It's the addiction. And as you know, with addictive behavior, there's less and less results for more and more investment. You see, that's the nature of it. Less and less. And it requires until you now are in a grip. And so if I am not brutally honest about my flesh signature, then I'm going to be vulnerable. And so my 4 are anger, revenge, sexual temptation, and coveting. I know none of you struggle with these, but with me, so and my 4 G's, I've shown you this before, and the revised edition of Conform to His Image actually has these 4 G's. The first edition did not. And so it lists the 4 G's as well. It mentions anger, revenge, sexual, and the other. But now I've come down to one word. If I can summon it up at that very tiny window when you're tempted to have the second look. You know what I'm talking about. The first look is nothing wrong, but the second, now you're gawking. And the flesh wants material to actually get more data. I've been starved of late. So I want, and in a split second, even a split second, it can suck so much data from that visual image that it's astonishing. So what you're needing to do then is you only have a short window. Somebody cuts you off on the highway, and you have a short window. Do you respond in this flesh or in the spirit? You know what I'm talking about. So do I respond with revenge? I do something stupid. Sorry, I want grace. They do something stupid. I want justice. It was malice aforethought. You know how that works. So we reach out for grace for ourselves and justice for others. And so I wasn't given justice. God did not treat me as I deserve. He treated me better than I deserve. He gave me grace rather than justice. And so if I can summon up, or gratitude, I cannot be angry and grateful at the same time. Try it out. So when you choose the way of gratitude, and contentment, so forth, these are choices. They're not just feelings. You choose, and you can be grateful, be thankful in all things. Then, and also happily they're G's, it makes it easier for me to remember these, you see. I'm very big on alliteration, as you all are painfully aware. But why do I use the word glory? Because the beauty would point to the glory of the one who made it, and also to the glory of the one who's the image bearer. This person is not to be treated as a subject, as an object rather, but as a subject. So the person is an bearer of that glory. And then the fourth one, coveting, has to do with goodness, because God is good and He's given me, He knows what I need. And so if I don't have then accountability, then I'm in a vulnerable state. And therein lies our problem with this text, because here he would then succumb to these kinds of themes. And because he didn't have someone who was asking him or listening to a Nathan or another who would tell him the truth. So these are important motifs that we need to keep in mind, don't we? So when the Philistines heard that they had anointed David over Israel, then the Philistines went up to seek out David. And when David heard it, he went down to the stronghold. And the Philistines came, spread themselves out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord. This is another side of his trusting in God. So there's a kind of a mixed story that we get with David. He inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And then the Lord instructed him, go up, I will certainly give them into your hand. So he goes up, and there is a breakthrough that takes place. Now what happens is they come up once again. They spread themselves out a second time. And then he inquired of the Lord again. Notice, he didn't just presume, I'll just do what I did last time. You see, that's the danger. You could take matters into your own hands. But instead, he was dependent upon God and sought His wisdom and instruction. I invite you to do that with your business, with your decisions, when you're making contracts, when you're working with your customers and clients, that you consult the Lord and seek to make it something that will be honoring to Him, because your work is an arena of worship. You don't go to work just to make a living. You go to work to have an arena of influence where you can, in the marketplace, where you have credibility because of you do your work as unto the Lord, and you serve your customers and clients because you have the wisdom of knowing that they're not your source, God is. And when you know that they're not your source, but if you think of them as your source, you're committed to manipulating them. But if you see them as a means God may or may not use, then you can serve them because you're looking to God for the outcome. Well, if you do your work with excellence and serve them, no matter what the outcome would be, then there's an integrity to your work that has a credibility. So you actually have credibility in the marketplace, an arena of influence that you otherwise would not have. And as a consequence, then, I see that as a theater, a context of worship where you can manifest things that transcend what is ordinary, because you do something with extraordinary excellence and skill. I see work then as worship. I see it as a matter of glorifying God. And so never have a sacred secular dichotomy, because remember, the spiritual becomes the secular becomes spiritual when? When does the so-called secular become spiritual? It's when the focus of your heart is on the eternal. So that is what suddenly ordinary, it becomes extraordinary because you're doing it as unto the Lord. You're doing your work with skill and quality. So in this case, he listened to God a second time. In this case, though, he said, you shall not go directly up. God never does the same thing the same way. Maybe you've noticed that. He is the God of boundless creativity. Sin is depressingly dull, predictable, and boring. You look at the 7 cycles of the book of Judges, it's the same old thing again and again. When are they going to figure this out? But every time he delivers them, his deliverances are never the same. Always creative, surprising. And you see, because righteousness is creative and sin is destructive. And so listening to God, then he hears him. This time he says, you're not going to go directly up. Instead, he says, circle around behind them and come at them in front of the balsam trees. It shall be, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then you shall act promptly, for then the Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines. And so the Lord is the one who did that. You see, it's a different theme. It's a different kind of a thing. And David obeyed him. So David did so, just as the Lord had commanded him. That's why he was a great man, because he did as the Lord commanded him to do. And that, to me, makes all the difference in the world. So we go back to this motif then of David with the Philistines. You see Philistia over on the left. And then ultimately then he would defeat them. And he would then hand over a great kingdom to his son Solomon. And then we see what Solomon brought it beyond imagination where he went. So there are multiple spiritual truths in this material that I think we can see. And it's an extraordinary piece of work indeed. Let me go back to the keys to 2 Samuel. The key verse in that book as a whole, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I'll set up your seed after you. So the whole book is really about a dynasty, a single dynasty in Judah. Whereas in the northern tribes, after the breakup again, after the United Kingdom, there would be a terrible division that would take place. And then there would be a loss of that. But here, there would be a kingdom, but there would be one generation, one dynasty that would continue, whereas there were multiple dynasties up in the north. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So you have these important themes. Or the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands, he recompensed me. But the sadness of the tragic sin with Bathsheba and Uriah is something that becomes definitive when we think about the spiritual truths that you have. So in 1 Samuel, the kingdom is established, and in 2 Samuel, the kingdom is consolidated, essentially. That's what we're looking. But it's one big book, though, and it's the unification of Israel, and Jerusalem becoming Israel's permanent capital, and that's where the temple would be built. And so Mount Moriah, and so the place where Abram's sacrificed, you see, that has a real symbolism because it's also Mount Calvary. So we have the extended boundaries that take place, as we've seen, radical prosperity that takes place. And again, in a theocratic covenant nation, that there is indeed a direct correlation between the fruit of obedience and the fruit of the vine. Because if you obey me, your borders will expand, you'll get the earlier and latter rains, you will defeat your enemies, and so you will have fecundity and beauty in your time. But so there are consequences to obedience, but there are consequences to disobedience as well, which are also quite material. Now, in the context of the new covenant, though, it's no longer the fruit of the vine, but rather the fruit of the Spirit. Because there's no evident reward in terms of material prosperity for godliness in the new covenant. you see. So I don't buy the prosperity gospel. But rather, the idea is that God will provide for you, but you look to Him for your provision. And even here then, the real benefit is not something material, but ultimately the fruit of the Spirit. And one book I'm working on right now with Russ Crossan, and it's a book on leverage and leveraging temporal resources for eternal gain. And so it's dealing with a guy who's a practitioner. He's with Ron Blue Trust, and he leads that. And so it's kind of an odd book because it's got a theologian and a practitioner. And so I write the stuff naturally. It would be dumb for me to write the practice, and he does the theory. No, I do the principles in the first half of the book, and then he does the practice in the second half of the book. And it's rather fun to work together in a collegiate effort. But the whole point is, what we're wanting to do is to be people who recognize that God has a purpose for us, and He had the purpose, just as He had a purpose for His people. And we recognize that would be a wonderful thing in the context of this old covenant, in the Mosaic covenant. An endless dynasty, and part of the Abrahamic blessing, the Abrahamic covenant, was land, it was seed, and it would be a blessing. And even now, you and I are recipients of that blessing, because the blessing component, because there was a land covenant, there was a seed covenant, but there's also the blessing part of the covenant, and that's what we call the new covenant. So that's actually that I will be a blessing. Through you, all the nations of the world would be blessed. And so this endless Davidic dynasty would ultimately lead up to Messiah himself and lead to that knowledge of God. Let's stop and see what questions and thoughts you might have. Yes, Leonard.
So you were talking about the time we live in and the incredible understanding we're gaining about God's creation. And the thought that came to me is how we are squandering this beautiful revelation. If you look at that same period of, I think you said 10 years, recently, a decade or two, in which we've had all the Hubble telescope and all these wonderful things that we've discovered, if you look at what the world is paying attention to, it's none of that. It's as if it didn't even happen.
Precisely so. In fact, the world is gushing about AI. We're gushing about our own capacity for the second Tower of Babel, which, by the way, we can't retro-engineer anything in nature with any measure of success. It's always more impressive than our greatest AI. But it's just like real. No, it's not. Any leaf will be enough you can't retro-engineer anything. A leaf, an insect, a flower, let alone a bird. Or you see, it's elegant, wonderful, beyond comprehension. And you can see, but former generations did not see this. So in my mind, we need to, so he's talking about this whole idea of us not being aware of this marvel in which we're embedded. And we spend so much of our time looking in the wrong direction. So I want to train people to see beauty again, to train them to see the wonders. And you and I are privileged to see things that others haven't seen under the sea as well as above. But at the same time, we can look at anything like this, and others could see this. And what you see is a marvel of engineering and wonder that transcends. Any cell in this would be big enough, more amazing than anything we could imagine. So I look at the structures of these and don't take it for granted, but instead come to appreciate the glory of the one who made all things. Because for me, again, as Tozer put it, what comes into a person's mind when he thinks about God is the most important thing about him. Well, how can I enhance my thinking about God? Well, I can use the visible, which points beyond itself to the unseen world. But then what I also now do is use the unseen world in special revelation, God's revealed word that tells us about his eternal power. More than this, just his eternal power and divine nature, it reveals the one who made all this is the lover of my soul. And that we could not have known from nature itself. So we see that, and you combine the two together, very powerful indeed. So that as I use my appreciation of nature It expands my vision of the one who made all things, and he's mysterious, terrifying, and marvelous. At the same time, though, I can use special revelation to help me appreciate what I see in the natural world. So they both amplify one another. And what I can learn from this, I mean, it just is what any of us can learn, is just beyond imagination. What it reveals about the mind of the Maker. Just it's the infinite variety. And you know that God has a sense of humor. You know, just look at this, look at these crazy turreted eyes and so forth. You know, it just marvels and wonders that we behold and see. I love this thing. Turns out there's a reason why he's on there, because he actually takes salt from the eye and uses that for his own purposes. The world is filled with marvels and wonders, and these things actually have like this extraordinary structures where they protect themselves in these manners. So I want you to spend less time on the news, and I want you to spend more time in the stop reading the times and read the eternities is what I'm suggesting here. You see, going back to that and really look at beautiful nature videos and things of this sort, because you can begin to see the glory of God on every order of magnitude. And when you see that, it gives me the one who can make these, not just the beauty of these things, you see, and how winsome, but also all that's involved in the epigenetic information, all of its instincts and all of its behaviors that transcend our imagination. I just love these ladybugs on top of each other. So the world is filled with wonder and marvel, and few people ever notice the marvel of the Maker. So we're talking about, even the possibility of a museum of beauty, a virtual museum. I'd love to use digital, that kind of technology. Where you could actually bring them into that and let them explore that. I think it'd be a wonderful concept. But what I want to do is I want to draw people into a greater apprehension of the glory of God in the world. Yeah. This is just beyond bizarre. Just love it. What another question?
Let's say forces from the left would say that by ascribing to their environmentalist religion, that they would be trying to claim that beauty and trying to protect it. The undercurrent may be absolute power and things like that, but there is a opposing force claiming nature on their side.
Yes. And so I want to leverage nature, because I think there are misunderstandings of nature because of a materialistic, naturalistic viewpoint, that you're stuck with that because you have to try to explain. I read one article just on symmetry and the idea of the symmetry that's there, and they're trying to explain that. There's a reason for that. Mathematically, it would tend to symmetry, but it's more than that. It's more than symmetry. It's elegance, things that are structures that are beyond your comprehension, beyond belief. That's why I want you to see the John 10:10 project and the Discovery Institute. Go to YouTube and just look up John 10:10 project. Look at those videos. Look up Discovery Institute and marvel and wonder, because these people are actually using nature specifically for the purpose you're describing. Instead of succumbing to a false narrative, they are in fact leveraging the wonder and beauty of the natural world for that gain, because this is how we worship God. And the prophets and the psalmists use nature to help us see His glory. If that's true, and you think about the terror of a thunderstorm, what do you think it's like when you consider then a black hole or something, galactic marvels and wonders? It's far, far bigger than we could have ever imagined. There's another question over on this side, I think.
Yeah, last question.
Last question.
Here,
Lewis.
I'll make this quick. In 1776, there was one Democratic Republic. I looked it up while you were talking. There's 195 now. A Democratic Republic has never waged war on another Democratic Republic. There are 57 totalitarian states right now. When you give too much power to too few people, 100% of the time it ends in war and mischief and death.
Yeah. So he's saying, yeah.
We still gravitate that way. What is pulling us?
Yeah, it's difficult for me to summarize your question. Yeah, or your comment, but you're quite right. The Democratic they don't wage war against each other. What you're going to see, though, is it doesn't take a majority for this evil to continue, and the manifestations of those things just continue to get pushed. But yet the strange thing is, in the university, that is actually approved of more than a democracy. That's what's intriguing. We're sending our kids to the Philistines to be educated. It's kind of a scary thing. It's paying a lot of money to do it too. But common sense is lost in our culture. And just with my last thing, as I say, we now have a collective, this is unprecedented, collective autism, collective amnesia, collective apathy. And new forces, new powers, the metaverse, scary because it has power over people and it will be used by manipulators. You don't have to have a majority to pull and weigh things down. A minority can do it. But yet at the same time, and this is where I end, I also know how it ends. And I know then that I have a robust confidence in the purposes of God. And all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And the fact is that God is preparing everything in this. Remember, I told you before, I'm a pessimistic optimist. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Jesus told us this. So if we're seeing this stage set for the next act being set, how much sooner then is the coming of the King? Then what's your response should be? It should be not to deal with this little tiny part of eternity, but rather to see how we can leverage this opportunity now for eternity so that we can actually use it to the glory of God. So that, if anything, you want to have urgency without anxiety, and you want to use your opportunity that you've got and not wring your hands in despair and curse the darkness, but be known for what you love and for what you pursue as a person who manifests a quality of life that demands an explanation. That you have a quality of character, of convictions, of consistency, that you are a person who is a man of joy and of love and of peace, of gratitude and of contentment. That will demand an explanation in this dark world. Philippians 4:8. I'll leave you with that. Philippians 4:8. Practice it.